Happy Friday, everybody. This is Jen Lee, and we are here for our 63rd automation hour. So if you haven't joined us in the past, all lines are muted. Please post any questions that you have to the Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community. We will be monitoring that and taking questions for Mark during his presentation. So it could be related to his presentation or any general process automation question. And as always, we will be posting the recording after the session, as well as the link to the deck. And you could access that information on automationhour.com or on the Trailblazer Community Salesforce Automation Hour. So we are fully booked out for 2019. So if you haven't registered for these sessions, I definitely encourage you to do so. Even if you can't attend live, you will receive a link to the recording after the fact. So we have a lot of different community members out there. We also have first-time speakers and as well as MVPs. And we can't bring this free webinar series without our sponsor, Concrete.io, so thank you so much. And here are your hosts, David Linton, Rakesh Gupta, and myself. And with that, we are very excited to have Mark Ross back. He's presented previously, and he was a former MVP along with the three of us. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Mark.
Thank you, Jen. Oh, hang on. Which screen are we sharing here? All right. Can you all see the deck?
Yep.
All right. You can still see it?
Yes.
Awesome. I never want to take any chances with presenting. I apologize to everybody. I'm a little bit out of it today. I had a red-eye flight. I was literally flying all night, so I'm a little bit tired, but I'm getting through because this is automation hour and I wasn't going to miss it. That's for certain. So yes, my name is Mark Ross. I am currently a doc writer for Education Cloud at Salesforce.org. I am no longer part of the normal admin ecosystem, though I have been an admin since 2010. I was Salesforce MVP for a few years, also co-host of a little show called The Wizardcast. If you haven't heard of it, it's a podcast. You can find it where all great podcasts can be found. It is me and Brian Kwong, and we talk about Salesforce, we talk about Flow, and we make lots and lots of bad dad jokes. It is about as tongue as cheek as we could possibly get. Also presented at Dreamforce and a few other things, but the main thing, well, not the main thing, this is the incidental thing, because I now work for Salesforce, I have to deliver this to you. It is forever in our hearts, not just a forward-looking statement. It is the safe harbor statement. Basically, you don't have to read all this, just saying anything I say, don't let it influence any purchasing decisions that you make. Yeah, I'm not going to really talk about things that aren't out yet in Salesforce, in Flow. Keep in mind, I don't work for the Flow team. I'm not responsible for any of that, but still got to cover my bases. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about something called contact request. What it is, what it does. We're going to take it apart, look under the hood, and then we're going to talk about what it doesn't do. And then in light of that conversation, we're going to talk about why we should still care about it, which I realize sounds a bit negative, but you'll see where I'm going with it once we get there. So what is contact request? Well, this is a brand new feature. It literally just came out in spring 19, and it does provide automation. It is for Community Cloud. Please stay in your seats. Don't get up yet. Just because it's Community Cloud doesn't mean we won't have a viable reason to talk about it here today. Even if you don't have Community Cloud, there are still some interesting aspects here that everybody should know about. It is available from the setup menu. While that may seem not unusual, I'll get to this in a moment. What it does is it gives your community members, your community users, the ability to request that they can be contacted by someone in your organization, probably support or financial help or whatever it is that you have set up. And it creates a flow. And what we're doing, what this feature does is, like I said, it's available from the setup menu. And when you activate it, it is going to make a flow for you in the system. So yeah, we're going to come back to all that. And what is it? Why are we talking about it today? Well, it's kind of a treasure trove of what? Once you start diving into it, there's so much here to unpack. And a lot of it's going to be confusing, and a lot of it, if you're like me, is going to fill you with frustration. But at the end of it, we hope to have something where we can still maybe use these pieces to put together something that can be useful, even if you're not deeply involved in Community Cloud. So what does it do exactly? Why are we even talking about it? First off, it enables a new core object, right? So this is an object that is not in the system until you turn on this feature. It will also, as I said, it creates a flow that you can then edit. It is not a locked down flow. This is where things start to get interesting. It's also going to create a special flow type. So for example, you have screen flows and you have auto launch flows. I'm sure we've all seen that. This is one that is a contact request type. And then it's going to create a core action. If you've worked in the new Flow Designer, which I hope we all have, the core actions are things like quick actions and other kind of built-in plugins. So enough talking about it. Let's go ahead and show what is going on here. All right, so right here, this is a community, very simple one. I've just stood it up. It's not a lot to it, of course, but if you look down at the bottom, we have here, well, what do we have? This looks like some kind of a interface that users can actually input stuff in. So, it's saying what's going on. You don't have to call us to get help. Tell us about your issue. We'll get back to you. So you can choose the reason. Let's say I need help with billing. And without asking for a description of the problem, we'll say something along the lines of, can't cancel my subscription through the website. Fairly standard. We click on next. And look at that. So it says, okay, please give us your name and phone number so we can contact you. Notice it automatically filled in information. That wasn't my browser filling that information in. That was the flow. I am in a community, right? And so, yep, I'm an authenticated user. It was able to pull in the authenticated user details and put them here as default values. I do want to say that this feature does work even if you don't have authenticated users, even if you have unauthenticated users, which thankfully, as of a few releases ago in Community Cloud, we now have the ability, and not just in Community Cloud, in Sites as well, you now have the ability to show flows to unauthenticated users. Didn't have that fully enabled before. And after we click next, it says, great, your request was sent. We'll be in touch. Awesome. So what did that do exactly? Well, right here, I'm in a console right here, and we can see here we go. This is a new contact request. Sure enough, here we go. Here's today's date and the time. This record was created as a result of me doing this. You can see I am in the contact requests object. Again, core object. And I can click into it, and I can see here are the details. Automatically assigned it to somebody else, filled in the information, and then we have a couple other fields that aren't filled in. And these are a little interesting. So let's for a moment take a step back and say, all right, this is actually a user who's reviewing this contact request, and they've seen it and they're like, oh wait, this pertains to an existing case. So I want to go ahead and set this contact request as being related to that. So I can actually go ahead and go in and I can select, hey, look at all that, guys. Pardon all my really weird objects that I have, because this is my personal org that I use for all sorts of things. But that is a multi-object lookup. All of my custom objects, cases, accounts, contacts, they're all available there. And then the requested by also contacts, leads, and people. This is when you actually start looking at the API, which I just so happen to have pulled up here. So this is the API documentation for the contact request object. If you haven't ever dived into the API documentation, the SOAP API documentation, I highly recommend it for one major reason, because you can find a list of every single core object in Salesforce, even the ones that are like kind of those background objects that are a bit more difficult to get to find any sort of information about. They're all here. And it has a list of all of the fields on each of those objects, even the ones that are system only that you can't access through a UI at all. So what's more, it will tell you, like, you can see if it's an auto number, what the type is. If you can edit it, it's going to have update as one of its properties. But if you're looking at something like the last viewed date, well, we never can do that. The system will lock that out, so the update flag isn't there. This API documentation is incredibly valuable if you just want to see all the things that a given object has, what's required, what's editable, and it'll sometimes go into dependencies as well. So I love having this available to us. But I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a bit, and sure enough, these are the two fields I was talking about: what ID and who ID. Now, this is not an activity object. This is not a new activity object, so calm down. But it's interesting that we have these multi-object lookup, multi-object reference fields. They're calling them what ID and who ID when they fulfill a very similar purpose. So just something to keep in mind there. We are going to encounter our own little share of roadblocks for this here, so we'll temper our enthusiasm for one moment. But that is essentially what this does. It is creating these records, and it's giving the user an ability to interface with that. And you may be saying, well, that's a little bit light. It's kind of cool that it does it. Yeah, it's pretty much exactly what I've just shown you. And there are some reasons I wanted to present this to you today, and we'll go over that here in a bit. So stick around. Let's go ahead and get under the hood and take this apart, though, first, so we can see exactly what it is we are dealing with. So when you want to do this, it's actually in the setup menu, and it is actually called Customer Contact Requests. And you click on that, and it takes you to this page. And we can see, here's the flow that I just used. It's only showing the customer contact request flows, not going to show any of the others here. Let's go ahead and walk through the creation of one, and I'll show you what all this looks like. So I'm going to click on New Flow, and the first thing it does is it starts asking me questions in a flow-like interface about making the flow. All right, fair enough. Well, let's go ahead and give this a name. We'll just call it Demo 2. I made a Demo 1 earlier, and I don't want to run the risk of hitting any sort of issues with that. You can put a description if you want. And then it's going to ask you, all right, what can your customers contact you about? These are the reasons, right? So if this were a case, it'd be like the case reasons. What are the kind of general categorization that you want to apply to your specific flow? And this is actually looking at a field. It's here. Let's go to the API documentation. It's this one here. It's this request reason. It's a pick list field, and you can edit it as normal in the object manager. You can add and remove values. If you do that, they will still show up here. So you do have the option of doing that. I'm going to go ahead and just pick all these and move them over. All right. And then who is the default assignee? All right, well, I'm gonna make sure these all go to my good friend Brian Kwong, because I want him to get all the emails and not me. Okay, so that's pretty much it. That's the default owner, and it says almost there. Now we just have to put it into our community. So it'll give you right off the bat the ability to click a link here, and it'll take you directly to the communities. And here we go. Here's a list of communities. Here's the one we're in. This is the one we were looking at earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Builder. All right, now I bet that looks familiar, right? This is what we were talking about before. This is what we were showing before. And here you can see, here's the one we already built. For the sake of the demo, though, I'm going to go ahead and take that off. And if you haven't worked with the Napoli community builder yet, this is going to be a little bit more familiar to us now that we've been in Lightning, right? We have a similar kind of interface where it's drag and drop of these blocks all over the place. Over on the left side, we have the components sidebar, which opens up all the things that we can drag and drop onto the page. So I could drag this flow over here onto the page, and I didn't drag it. I didn't drop it in the right place. There we go. And once you drag it there, you choose the flow that you want, and there, the demo 2, that's the one we just made. That's all there is to it. And then that flow is assigned to that. Another option we have for this, instead of having the flow directly on the page, you also have the ability to do the contact request button and flow. That's what it says. It's cut off. So I'm going to drag this here. And that makes a button. So rather than having the actual flow directly embedded on the page, there's a button embedded on the page that is there to call that flow. Now that I've made my changes, I need to click Publish. This is the Community Builder equivalent of Save. All right, so that is going to run in the background. It's got a couple things to do. While it's doing that, I'm going to head on over back to our flow. We're going to dive into it. Now let's check real quick, see if the community has been updated. There it is. So right there, that was not there before. And this is our flow button. When you click it, it pops up the flow in a modal directly over the page instead of it taking up actual real estate on your screen. Yeah, there we go. There's the end result. So now let's actually take a good look under the hood. Here is the flow that gets created, and it's relatively basic, right? There's not a lot to it. And you can see 3 out of the 4 things that are here are screens. So that is, it's a relatively simple thing. This one, the core action, we're going to take a look at that later. We'll go ahead and start with the screens because they're relatively simple. So we're going to notice something very interesting right off the bat. Here's our text. And notice what we have here. I wasn't even aware. Now, granted, I haven't been doing a lot of flow since I became a doc writer instead of an admin for the past, couple months. But this is something I wasn't aware was possible in the new Flow Designer, and that is the fact that we have HTML with CSS classes defined in order to give yourself rich text on your page. That was kind of one of the things that a lot of people, I'm sure, noticed when if they had rich text defined on their flows. When they came over to the Flow Builder, all of a sudden, all that rich formatting was disabled. And I hadn't had a chance to figure out a way around it. Well, apparently, when at least in your display text, we do have the ability to do these. And one thing that is, may look like a lot of gobbledygook to you because as admins, we don't necessarily dive into things like CSS a whole lot. But notice we have in our CSS here, there's this little header that we see a few places: SLDS, 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 SLDS. If you're not familiar with that, what that means, that is short for the Salesforce Lightning Design System. And what this is basically all the guidelines that Salesforce uses to show Lightning, to present it. So it's the Lightning components, but it is also the visual, the graphic definition for how the layout happens and how the CSS works. And I'm going to actually look here. I'm going to show you here on this page. This is lightningdesignsystem.com. So on this page, I'm going to click on utilities and then click on one of these examples to show you what these are. And you can see here there's some text. This is showing an example of how you would use this particular SLDS tag. The way it works is essentially you can call in your HTML and your pages and whatever you're working with, you can call a class that is an SLDS class, and it will automatically apply CSS, a full CSS definition to whatever it is you have that is automatically set. I don't have to worry about any of the details that go along with using SLDS Align, because I know that when I use SLDS Align, I am automatically going to get what Salesforce has Lightning using as central alignment. And if Salesforce, for whatever reason, needs to change that, it will do so, and everything I've used will automatically be brought up to that current visual standard. I will never have to go back and redo any of my formatting if I'm using SLDS, because it will always be whatever Salesforce is currently using. So this is really, it can get really technical and get really nitty-gritty, but the utility section will give you examples of all these classes, all these SLDS classes and how you can use them. And they're going to be pretty valuable if you're going to start diving into using rich text in your flow. I do not know, I have not experimented enough to know exactly like what are the limitations here in terms of what types of CSS. I would wager that not a lot of your normal HTML definitions are going to be able to be used because of security reasons. But I'm sure that's something that many people will be diving into in the community if they haven't already. For now, it's just really good to know that this is here. And frankly, even if you're never going to use this flow, you can still create this and then have some examples for you to refer back to. All right, so moving on past all of that. Here we can see request reason. This is what we were asking for. Notice what it did. If you've ever seen the XML in the background for a process that you've built in Process Builder, because that's what Process Builder is, right? It's flows. It's automatically generated flows, kind of like what this is. A lot of that XML, a lot of that background is going to look very generic, and that's what's happening here. If I go take a look at each of these choices, these look like terribly generic names that aren't very helpful, but if you look at the actual values here, you can see, okay, well, that's the pick list. So what it's doing is, by default, when it's automatically generating these, it's just not putting any naming on them. It's using generic naming, but it's giving you all your pick list values. And of course, we're capturing a description. Nothing fancy there. Next screen. So this is where they were asking for the name and number. And notice, remember, if you will, that it picked up the name and phone number of the running user, the person, the authenticated user who is in. Now, if you've worked at all with Lightning and Flow, you know that sometimes passing in variables, like passing in a user ID, can be kind of difficult. And when we made this flow, and I can assure you that this flow is set up, there is nothing passing in a user ID variable into this flow. So how was it able to get that information? And there's a trick to this. I'm sure some of you probably all know this, but just in case for people who haven't seen this, there's a trick in Flow to being able to get running user information into your flow without having to pass those variables in any way. So flow formulas, I'll take a look at the phone formula here as an example, are able to use $user. And even though we haven't actually passed in anything, we can still use $user. I can actually type it in, and you can see here are our global variables, $user, and it will let me, pick up something else like $user if I need to get whatever they're, let's say if they're active or not. It'll let me populate that in, and the flow will be able to access that. It is going to work. So that's really, really powerful and valuable, particularly when you're doing things like running a flow from an action in Lightning, right? Because you can't pass in any variables except your current running record ID. So even though you are limited when you're running your flow from an action in Lightning, you can still get your running user information by piping in the $user. It will still work into a flow formula. Now, one thing I want to make sure that I'm clear on here, just because I'm in this, what this is doing is saying, okay, if the running user's mobile phone is blank, use their phone number, but if it's not blank, use their mobile phone. So the mobile phone has priority. Maybe your system is different. Maybe you expect your users, your running users, sorry, I should point out one thing if you're not familiar. Community, when you're in community, your authenticated users, they are going to probably, a lot of them be contacts, but they are also going to be a lower form of user as well. And they're generally tied together if both of them exist. So that's why, even though we're talking about communities, we're talking about customers, $user, and this is still a valid thing. It's still how it works. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that was clear. That when I first started using communities years ago, that was a bit confusing to me. But okay, to go back to what I was talking about. So let's say your company is different. You expect all of your community people to have phones, but not necessarily mobile phones. You want to reverse this? Well, we can change it. I mean, I may be in a system-generated flow, but I can still make changes, and it will still work. If during this process, when they've created a contact request, I need them to make a case as well, because notice there's nothing else happening here. I can still do that. I can do a create record, and I can make it create a case. I can go through this whole process. I can add, make changes. I can customize this flow that was a system-generated flow. And stop and think about that for 1 second. This right here is one of the main reasons why I wanted to demo this to everybody today. This is showing a way in which Salesforce is delivering a feature to customers. If I go back to when I first started doing Salesforce work in 2010, or even so far as back as last year, this whole period of time, yes, we have a large degree of customization that we can do, but for a lot of these Salesforce delivered features, when they deliver something to you, like let's say email the case, there's very little customization you can do in how that actually operates. It took years for them to give us any kind of control over the emails that were going out in response to certain types of service console happenings, events. And certain ones, they still don't have any control over. The fact that Salesforce is actually handing us a feature and then saying, all right, you know what, we understand that this is something that different companies are going to use in different ways. We're going to let you just tweak it yourself, as opposed to them saying, you know what, we're kind of the Apple of what we do. We know best. Yes, you're not going to get every possibility, but it's going to be a solid feature and you're going to get something out of it. That is not the approach they're taking here with this particular feature delivery. So that in and of itself to me is utterly fascinating. As someone who doesn't work on flow development, who doesn't work on Community Cloud, who doesn't really work on product development outside of managed packages for nonprofits and educational purposes, this is fascinating to me. That this is something that might be something they do. This might be the first step in a bigger paradigm. All right, so enough of my rant. I'm going to jump ahead to the last screen just because there's not a lot to show here. It's just more text with more formatting, woohoo formatting. And let's go ahead and take a look at this. So this is a core action. Again, if you haven't had a lot of dealings with the new flow builder, the core action, let's go ahead and just start to create a new one, and I can show you what they are exactly. Let's look at the list here. These are things that you probably have seen before. They are things like quick actions that you have the ability to access in Flow before. There are also things like, oops, scrolled too far. Send email, submit for approval. If you worked with Flow at all before, those are things that are just kind of core functions of Flow, possible things that you can do. Well, this is their home now in the new Flow Builder. The Flow Designer is here on this core action section. And what this has done is created a new one. And to be honest, I couldn't quite figure out where this was created exactly. It's not Apex because it would show up in Apex Actions. I couldn't find it in the quick actions anywhere, but it's just something that's available, and it's called Create Customer Contact Request. And that is what this uses. Let me go back into the actual one, and we can see how it has populated here. So what this appears to be doing is in the back, it's doing the record create. I'm uncertain if it's doing anything else. I tried to do some research, and unfortunately, I couldn't get anything confirmed prior to press. But it's passing in. Here's the owner, as we set, right, in the when we were first running through the flow, which was helping us create the flow. Preferred channel. This is interesting. Preferred channel is a thing here. It is a field here that is on the object. If we take a look back at the actual API here, we can see there is a field called preferred channel. And if we look at the contact request, there is preferred channel, but it was nowhere in the actual flow that the user interacted with. Basically, they're leaving it here as something you can add. You can put in the screens if you want. You can work with it and present it to the users, or you can just leave it alone. Preferred phone number. So this is, again, they could type in their own. Request reason was the pick list. Request status by default setting to new. The description is what they filled in. And then the requested by, so this is a contact formula. What it's doing here is it's passing in if this community user has a contact ID associated with it, it would pass that into that requested by field. So there we go. That's pretty much what it does. Now we've explored it and we've gone through it, but we have a few issues, because there are some things that it doesn't do. And some of these, I will warn you now, are going to be frustrating, but we'll get through all of this together. So brace yourselves. What doesn't it do? So first off, any flow you make through this doesn't actually show in your main flow list. If you go and look, if you click on flows in the setup menu, you won't see any of the flows here. You won't see the customer contact request flow in that list. So you have to get to it from the customer contact requests page. Okay, minor annoyance, not a huge deal. What else? Well, any flow that you make cannot actually be used outside of communities. Okay, that's a little bit more of a problem. Now, theoretically, I'm going to take a step out here. If we wanted to, we could, well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Why is that exactly? It's this. This is why these two things don't work. If we look at the type, you know what? This is my tiredness kicking in. I'm just going to do this. All right. If I click Save As, the type that it shows is, remember I said that it's creating a new flow type? Well, this is it, the contact request flow. I can't change it at all, right? But that is what is actually setting this as something that is available in communities, only available in communities, and is only available through that contact request page. Now, if I want to, though, I do have a way of getting around this because I can click on, instead of saving as a new version, I can save as a new flow, and there we go. Now I can change it to a screen flow, and it will work perfectly well. So it's kind of an arbitrary limitation, kind of an annoyance, but it is something we can get around. Not too insurmountable. Just kind of especially, when you're first going through this, because as I was taking this apart, when I was starting to use, I knew I wanted to present on this because I loved the paradigm. I loved the idea of what Salesforce was doing for feature development. And I knew I wanted to present on this. So I started to dive into it, and I started hitting these roadblocks, and I'm like, what? Why? So the least I can do is actually present this information to you guys so you don't hit the same like discovery roadblock set that I was hitting. And then there are issues with the contact request object. This is where we encounter the grinding of teeth. First off, the contact request object itself, we saw it had the what ID and the who ID. That sounds great because they're multi-object lookups, which we don't get very often. That's fantastic. But I'm not certain, but I believe it's this fact right here which causes a couple more issues further down the pike. First of which is that you cannot make a lookup at all to the contact request object. It's not possible. Again, if I head back out, I'll just real quick pull up a quick example here. I can find something. Let's just go to Object Manager and just make a random field here. We'll do a lookup relationship, and contact request is nowhere to be seen. You just can't make a lookup to that object, presumably because we have the multi-object lookups. Okay, all right, we can get around that, yeah? Well, we also can't place its related list anywhere. In other words, once you've made a contact request and you can relate it to a case, you can't actually see it from the case. And I still don't understand why this is, but I'll show you an example. Let's go ahead and go back out to the Object Manager. We'll go to Page Layouts, and we'll take a look at a case layout. And sure enough, when I look at related lists, it's not here. When I look at, let's associate with this with a case. Back at my contact request, we'll hit Save. Let's take a look at that case, and there is simply nothing anywhere that lets me see that contact request, which means that the contact request is purely a start point. The contact requests you can set up so that there is automation. You can set up omni-channel so they get automatically routed based on whatever criteria you set in that. You can set them up as triggers from process builders. You can say when a contact request is created or edited, go do these things. So that all works. That's great. I presume because of that, Apex also works. But the actual diving in from into a contact request from anything other than the contact request doesn't seem to be a thing that exists. So there is frustration there, and there are problems here. Now, I have not tried this. This occurred to me yesterday when I was sitting in the airport. It's possible that something like the enhanced related list, which if you're not familiar with that, that is a App Exchange package. I'm just gonna go away from here. It's released by Salesforce Labs, and it's interesting. It's not necessarily the most intuitive design. There we go, CMT. It's the custom metadata enhanced related list. This is really interesting because it will let you create related lists of your own that are filtered. So you can say, only show me the cases that are open in one particular related list. You can apply these little visual tags to them as well, so that the things stand out more. You can show more than 4 records if you want on a related list. So you can say show up to 100 or something like that. So there's a lot of possibility here, and I have not tried it. I haven't had a chance, but it's possible that you could create a one of these custom related lists that show that if you wanted to get around it. Show the contact requests on the case object. So caveat there, that's a safe harbor statement. Don't know if it's possible or not. But the fact that that is a limitation is nonetheless galling and bothersome, and might be more of a dead end than we'd hope. Also, just things for you to be aware of when you do enable the contact requests. It is going to be not added anywhere by default. You have to add the object to your consoles, to your apps. I encountered issues. The documentation officially states that it does by default give permissions to the admins. It didn't for me. I don't know if that's just because I have a very old org with a very old dev org with a lot of nonsense in it. But something to be aware of when you go to enable it, if you, for whatever reason, can't get to it anywhere. Part of it is because of the issues with getting to it, but also because of permissions. So you may need to give yourself as admins. So actually, no, it gave me permissions. Sorry, let me be more clear. It gave me permissions on the object. The tab was set for admins to tab hidden by default. I had to go into the admin profile and enable the tab in order to actually see the tab. And then your users, they of course won't have any permissions to start with. So you'll have to go add them to the give them permissions for the context request object and tabs as well. So given all this pain, all this oddity, why should we still care? Well, it's still useful for what it is, right? And I don't mean that to be disparaging, the humorous GIF aside here. If you are, let's say for users out there who are admins who are relatively new, particularly to Communities Cloud, or maybe they're new to Flow, and they need something like this for their users, well, it still does exactly what it says on the tin, right? It is still going to give you the ability to very quickly and easily set up something that is a flow that interacts with your community's users. And hey, that's great. That's powerful to be able to set that up so quickly and easily with minimal configuration, minimum time spent on the configuration. What's more, for users who, like I said, are new to Flow, maybe it will give them an example. It's going to create them a flow by default, and then they can go and look at it and start to pick it apart and start to base new flow design off of that. So it's, for what it is still useful to those users. For the rest of us, there are still useful things to get out of this that we can pick apart. Maybe you can use the contact request object for a very particular use case that you've got. Maybe the flow, like I said, the text with the formatting that we had in there, maybe that's valuable to you so that you can get into it and start to tinker with that formatting. There are still bits we can repurpose here. And of course, as I mentioned before, what I'm most excited about is this new type of delivery that Salesforce is trying. And I don't 100% know that Salesforce hasn't tried this before. You know, when you look at the different flow types, there's like a field service flow as a new flow type. For all I know, there is a they've done something similar with a guided setup flow that gets created automatically, but I'd never seen it before. I hadn't tinkered enough with field service, and the fact that they're doing it this way, as I said, is so interesting and so potentially powerful. And because of that, this makes the last reason all the more important, because this isn't perfect, right? We've seen here that there's some cool stuff here, and they've released something, but there are some issues with this that prevent this from being something that we admins would consider to be like a class 1 object and class 1 feature set. It prevents it from being something that we can use in all places for all things like we love to have. We love all the tools in our toolbox to be used for all the different things. And this is something that is not, right? It has those limitations. And so if you like the paradigm, if you like the idea, but you're frustrated by what is released here, you need to let Salesforce know that, hey, we like where you're going with this, but we want you to improve upon it. If you don't let Salesforce know, guess what? We can't change it. I mean, for all I know, the product managers are well aware of these issues, but for all you know, they don't. For all you know, they're not aware, and they haven't put any more thought into it. And it needs people like you, people out in the community, to come back to them and say, hey, this is great, but without that, and it's not just the idea exchange, right? That's one place to start, but it's also engaging with the community, engaging with Twitter, reaching out to people who are in the Salesforce product management team and explaining to them what the issues are. Don't be afraid, right? Every person, I might catch hell for this later, Every person on this call should feel free to tweet at Mike Rosenbaum if there's a lightning feature or a general feature you have issue with. Everybody should feel free to do that because that's how Salesforce works, right? And if you don't know who Mike Rosenbaum is, he's the EVP of product, right? Executive Vice President. He is up there. But everybody should feel free to reach out to him because he wants to know these things. He wants to hear from everybody and about your experiences. So that's why this is important for us to talk about as well. With that, I am done with my presentation. So if anybody has any questions, we can do that, or I'm happy to help with anything. But regardless of anything else, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Automation Hour staff, for having me.
Great. That was a great presentation, Mark. All right, so for folks, if you want to post a question for Mark or the Automation Hour team about Mark's presentation or any process automation question, go out to Salesforce Automation Hour's Trailblazer community. The link is in the chat to post your question. So while we give folks a couple minutes to do that, we did have a question from Matthew. What is the use case for this that is different than a case?
That's a good question. So it's a very, very specific thing, right? It's the idea that, to be honest, I don't know the full answer, right? I didn't help design this, so I can only speculate. It's the idea that you have a very, very specific thing that maybe you don't want the people who route cases to normally handle, right? Maybe this is something that you want to set up only for billing, and so therefore your finance people need to be in front of it, because this isn't necessarily only a B2C kind of solution. This can also be a B2B solution. One of my previous companies I worked for was Auto Trader, and one of the things that would happen sometimes is that, a car dealership, a business who was one of our customers, would call in and say, hey, we've got an issue with our billing. So they would also need to have a method to get in. Maybe you have a community for businesses, not just like what we think of as an end user consumer. And for that, but then you also have end user consumers as well. So maybe you need to separate those out. I don't know the full answer to your question, unfortunately. I can only speculate, but it's a very narrow definition. I suspect that is why.
Okay. Gaurav says, awesome presentation. Did they ever go GA with the generate orders flow? I'm very excited about this as a way of delivering features that admins could customize.
Hi, Gaurav. I have no idea. Sorry. I'm not familiar with that, so I can't answer. Sorry. I'm not a Flow employee.
All right, we're gonna need to mention Shannon Hale.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Bob asks, hi Mark, great presentation. Question, if you do use the save as to be able to use this flow for other use cases, will that new flow show up with your other non-system generated flows?
Yes, it will. It will show up there with the rest.
Okay. I have a question. So I know you created this in your personal DE org. Now, would people normally create this in a sandbox, and do you promote it up to production?
Ooh, that's an interesting thing. So because it's got metadata, right, that is potentially not enabled in any given org that you go to, right? Because if you haven't turned this on, that contact request object is not going to be there. And if you tried to access it with a data loader, it would return an error to you, right? So because the metadata is not there, if you tried to do any kind of deployment before enabling it on both sides, it's going to fail. So I know that for start. In terms of the deployment for the rest of it, I mean, theoretically, it's a flow that you could deploy. I'm not personally familiar with community deployment and how that works. So I can't answer that one. I apologize. I haven't done enough work in the Community Cloud to know if community deployment is a thing, but I suspect it is.
Okay. All right, we're going to give another minute or so for folks out on the Trailblazer community. So Mark, how did you learn Flow?
Ooh, how did I learn Flow? So actually, in a similar way to you, Jen. My first Dreamforce I went to was 2010.
Oh.
And they, yeah, I know. And I was just learning about stuff, and I had done a little bit of work with Salesforce, but not a lot in terms of tinkering at that point. I was actually not an admin yet. I went before I was an admin, but I was trying to absorb as much as I could because I'd seen the potential, and I saw this thing called Flow in the agenda, and it looked like it was for configuration. I was like, oh great, I love configuration. Let's hop into it. And they showed me the Flow designer that existed in 2010. And if you're not familiar with that is, it was literally an exe file you ran on your computer.
Desktop Flow designer.
Yeah, it saved a file. You had to upload the file to Salesforce on the Flows page. And so that was, I saw this and blew my mind at the sheer amount of possibility in the Flow designer in 2010. and so that was where I started like diving into it, and I talked to the product manager at the time, and I grilled him with questions, and I got as much as I could out of him, wrung him like a towel, and then I absorbed anything he posted online about it, and I would tinker with it myself, even though like my own company wasn't using it that much. I still was like, I need to tinker with this. I need to explore this. And then by the time I moved to another job, like I was able to fully implement it and keep going with that. So it was really just the same kind of hungriness and just absorbing everything I could back at that period. I don't even think there was some documentation. There were some PDF files I had to parse through, but there wasn't any video. There was no trailhead. I got what I could. Back in my day, we had to go uphill both ways in the snow.
And when Mark says, just like you, Jen, what I did was I went to Dreamforce and I hoarded all the process automation sessions that I could attend. All right, let's do another refresh to see if anything has come in since then. And I do not see any more questions. So I want you to get some more sleep because you came back on the red eye. So I don't think we're going to hold you up any longer, but we do appreciate you coming back and presenting, and we would love for you to come back in the future again.
Oh, thanks, Jen. I will do that. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, here's my information. Feel free. I'm more than happy to help however I can. And even if it's like something that maybe is a Flow PM question, I'm not going to be able to solve it for you, but I can maybe help you get to the right person. So feel free.
Great. And with that, thank you everyone for joining us. And until next time, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.